Hello, and welcome back, most illustrious members of the Detail. I'm your host D, also known as MTF Doom on Marvel Snap, and today we're going to talk about Yomi Layers, what they are, and how we can use them to our advantage for fun and profit. I hope you enjoy. Before we get into it, as always, a big thank you to everyone who makes this channel possible. You have the outro card. I will thank you all by name or moniker. Thank you to everyone who watches. Big shout out to everyone who watches all my content, and an equal big shout out to everyone who just sticks around, even if you don't watch all of it, because you don't really like Magic the Gathering or Final Fantasy VII, but you stick around regardless because you like some of it. I really appreciate that. A like and a subscribe goes a long way, and especially a Discord join. It's the best way to get in contact with me and to be able to kind of influence what we do here. So a big appreciation for all of that. So what are Yomi Layers? Well, Yomi, translated literally from Japanese, means underworld, but colloquially it refers to reading the opponent's mind. The term was popularized and sits firmly in the lexicon of fighting games. Personally, I first heard it at my LGS like a decade ago. It was a tiny hole in the wall that held all kinds of card game events, but importantly also Smash Bros tournaments. And the co-owner at the time, a guy named Demeta, who I reached out to when doing research for this video and caught up with, he actually runs another game involving Yomi Layers now called Blood on the Clock Tower. So if you're ever in Connecticut for whatever godforsaken reason and you want to play a cool-ass hidden roles game, look up the Facebook group. I'll link it down below. Anyway, he was heavily involved in both Magic the Gathering and Smash, and he introduced me to the term, and I've kind of kept it in my mental library of useful knowledge ever since, and I just want to pass it along today because I think it can give a huge advantage when understood properly. So to start, what are Yomi Layers? Well, Yomi Layers are repeating patterns of play revolving around the consideration or lack of consideration of shared knowledge. In the simplest form, they can be described as follows. The inputs of a game are either rock, paper, or scissors, and the outcomes are either win, lose, or tie. So Yomi Layer 0 is just throwing one of these three pieces at random or without the consideration of the opponent's play patterns. Think of that famous Simpsons line,
"Good old rock. Nothing beats that."
Yomi Layer 1, then, is the consideration of that knowledge. If we use the previous example, and you're known for throwing rock, or indeed if rock is simply a dominant strategy in the current meta, it could be reasonable for an opponent to read this play and adjust to a more paper-heavy strategy. Yomi Layer 2 can then be further understood as the initial player realizing that their opponent either puts them on rock or is likely to play to beat rock for meta reasons and adjusts to a more risky scissors strategy, accepting that a misread of the situation will lose to someone on Yomi Layer 0 who is committed to solving all their problems with rocks, but beating those more invested in the higher layers of gameplay through clever maneuvering. And finally, Yomi Layer 3 sees the opponent realizing that you may take advantage of their likely play and adjust to either a rock strategy as a safe hedge against both the usual openers as well as the scissors counterpick, or a scissors strategy to cover both Layer 1 and 2 players. Now, to further confound this theorem, within a card game context, some players are more likely to play hard counterpick strategies and others to hedge against multiple strategies. And all this might seem confusing right now, but I promise we're going to break it down into more simple, relatable snap bites, okay? And then finally, there are some schools of thought that say that there are 4 Yomi Layers, as we've covered in the above example, and some that say there are unlimited, but funnily enough, the difference between those is kind of negligible and pedantic in a lot of ways. Like, take the example here to its logical conclusion, or the poison scene from The Princess Bride, or if you're more autistic like me, the scene with Captain Amazing and Casanova Frankenstein from Mystery Men.
I knew you couldn't change.
I knew you'd know that.
Oh, I know that. And I knew you'd know I'd know you knew.
But I didn't. I only knew that you'd know that I knew. Did you know that?
Of course.
And you can see how trying to guess at a deeper Yomi layer quickly devolves back into random chance, effectively resetting to layer 0. Taking all this into account then, we can finally get to what this video is about and actually craft decks and make decisions both on the micro and macro level to take advantage of Yomi Layer 0 and 1 players especially. And in fact, that's how this channel began. One of my first videos was an examination of a Jeff Hoogland deck. We took into account his influence and contributions to the metagame. We developed a strategy that was both reasonable into a semi-randomized pool of decks, as well as advantageous into the deck that he had recently released a video on, functionally Yomi Layer 0 and 1 respectively, and saw success with that deck, as well as lots of people resonating with that idea. And in the months since that video, there have been a bloom in the diversity of voices in the Snap community, or at least in the plurality of them. And as such, trying to keep up with enough creators that we can build counterpicks to their kind of overhyped lists is just not within my ability or time constraints, leading to me mostly talking about this as it relates to big, sweeping, meta-shifting cards like Kitty Pryde. So, in a very important way, we can actually understand this new plurality of voices to be a force for good for our purposes, as while it can be frustrating seeing a new list suddenly appear seemingly from nowhere, it also kind of forces players, especially ones that aren't interested in building decks themselves, into like this weird Yomi Layer 0.5. But even if we identify this, like how do we take advantage of it? By playing the most brain-dead Layer 0 deck possible, of course. Now, this won't be true forever, but currently the trend, especially among content creators, is to value high-impact, flashy, clippable plays over more disciplined, fair, and interactive lists. The only exception to this rule being when those lists are also optimal play patterns. Usually it's a sort of like Mr. Fantastic Scorpion White Queen deck getting jammed into a new or shaken up meta. This isn't a failing on the content creator's part, by the way. I want to make that clear. Second Dinner can put their thumb on the scale anytime they want, and we've seen them do that in the past with things like the Enchantress buff. But currently Cosmo is hilariously underrepresented in the meta, and Enchantress is somewhat underrepresented, and for as long as that does remain true, this deck is going to take advantage of that fact, with the understanding and acceptance that we will simply fold to Cosmo, and we have to be okay with that. So, some tips for this deck, especially for Conquest mode, include snapping before playing negative for the first time, being willing to retreat and hide that your deck is actually doing this until you can get your opponent to commit to a large pot with you on a good hand. Generally, your strongest hands are something like Kitty Pryde, Zabu, and Negative, and not Iron Man or Mystique. You want them still in your deck. And trying to catch them out of position by having them put you on a bounce deck, right? Because especially if you play Bast and Kitty Pryde early, they might think you're something else, and that's one of the biggest advantages you'll have, at least in terms of cube equity. In general, if Negative hasn't shown himself, you don't want to play Jubilee into the Wong lane, because while she will pull 2 cards, which is generally good, if she pulls Negative, you've wasted a spot, you've given up info, and you won't have the negative effect, right? Because he'll swap the cost and power, but then he'll swap them again, returning them back to normal. And then finally, a huge key to remember is that if you can play Iron Man and something else in the same turn, you want to make sure to play Iron Man last in case of a Mystique draw, or in case of just having Mystique in hand. Some things to look out for are the turn 5 wave especially in this version, which doesn't run magic. I actually think I might tweak this a little more. I really like the Gambit. I really like the White Tiger, but I kind of think I want magic because Wave really, really destroys this. If you're not going to make that change, or if you just don't have magic, being willing to commit some of your drawn 0-cost cards on 5 instead of 6, while that does open them up to Shang and Enchantress, can be a way to get around the wave. As well, lockdown location effects may stop you from playing your big on reveals into a Wong and Mystique lane, and that can kind of be a death sentence as well. If you don't have the cards here, or if you don't have negative in general, then just keep this strategy in mind, as well as being willing to abandon these types of decks if you sense the meta shifting to playing more interactions, especially relevant interactions, or if those interactions get buffed. If Cosmo became a 3/4, you could expect him to start showing up notably more, if only because he gets put back on people's radar as a card that you might want to play. A final note here is that not all high roll decks are created equal, and high roll decks that fold to a Shang are notably worse off right now than those that fold to a Cosmo, and so keep that in mind when building your high roll Yomi Layers 0 type deck. So that covers the way that we can take advantage of Yomi to deal with like net decking in the meta sense, but how can we use Yomi to our advantage within a game? The answer here is much more nebulous and less satisfying, I'm afraid, but I'll try to go over some relevant examples to add to your library of viable plays. The first and easiest example is winning all 3 lanes, or winning 2 and tying the last going into turn 6. This can also include locations that you've identified as an auto tie or auto win based on the likely set of opponent cards. Think destroy locations if you have a Bucky Barnes or a Colossus. These locations are obviously almost always able to be stormed or Scarlet Witched last turn, but in general, we're talking about going into a turn 6 with like an 80% chance that the opponent just doesn't have a relevant card for the location, and ideally that they don't realize that we do have a relevant card, okay? So, against most decks, this position of winning all 3 going into turn 6 is the best position, the one with the greatest advantage, both in terms of cube equity and outcomes, as relevant interaction at this point, even if the opponent had something like a Serra and Zabu, is limited to a combination of like Killmonger, Shang, Enchantress, or the stats of another 4-cost, sort of as the high end. But importantly, for at least the deck we've outlined, Cosmo is no longer a relevant interaction because they don't have priority. Generally, this position is pretty easy to evaluate, like if the combination of relevant interactions can overcome their point deficit and the power you're about to play to the board, you retreat. Like you can kind of see that coming most of the time. If not, you snap. Some general rules here, if you do want them, would be to split your ongoings and 9+ power cards into different lanes when possible, right? So a Shang or Enchantress isn't hitting multiple relevant threats. And be willing to abandon one lane, knowing that they'll still need to commit points just to overcome a tie, right? So you can focus on 2 lanes, knowing that either one's going to tie, or one is going to be, even if they have to commit a 1 cost, that only suddenly leaves 5 energy for them to work with to win the other 2. For the sake of time, I'm going to simply refer to this same description that I've just outlined in the set of advice, but in reverse for any game state where you're losing all lanes going into round 6. So if you can win an uninteractable location in the way we talked about before and in a way an opponent might not see, or you possess multiple pieces of hyper-relevant reactive interaction, right? So not Cosmo, that will undo an opponent's game plan, it is likely worth taking the chance at big cubes from someone in that strong position. The next 2 positions also are the same but flipped. and they're the most common and most difficult to navigate, and the advice for them becomes more nebulous and is also directly inverse to each other. So we'll start with the position of winning 2 lanes and losing 1. And again, just take the advice from the opposite understanding to identify your position in a losing 2 and winning 1 scenario. So basically, here we're talking about having priority going into turn 6 and having an advantage in power, but not an overwhelming one like we were in the last scenario. This is maybe the weakest position, except for the losing all 3 lanes position, but presents much more of a challenge in play patterns because it will invite you to finish the game regardless of if you're likely to lose, while the losing all 3 lanes position kind of invites you to retreat on most snaps unless you're almost certainly able to win. And so, in these positions, it's most important to keep the types of cards your opponent might have in their deck in mind especially. And I know that's not like, I know you might want more rigid advice than that, but a deck like Zola Panther might appear to be behind, but if you're unable to overcome the swing of 2 Panthers doubling again on 6, or if you don't see it coming and you overcommit to the Panther lane before having the rug pulled out from under you by a Zola, and you end up winning a lane that they have 0 power in and just being short of winning a different lane, you're going to have a bad time. The unfortunate reality is that these positions become so complex and nuanced, and as stated in the intro, are further compounded by the fact that some players will hedge or play multiple different strategies, and some are likely to go all in on one strategy, that the best advice I can give to you using Yomi is to keep notes on good and bad matchups and just adjust your snap and retreat styles to reflect those realities, adding in maybe some percentage points to your win rating if you so choose by playing cards that are both unusual and weirdly relevant, like Arrow or Gambit. Perhaps the strongest position for a deck then is being at a slight point deficit going into turn 6, such that you can overcome the disparity in a number of interesting ways that are hard to predict or impossible to play around for most decks. This position to me is the reason why Kitty Pryde shines so much, being a relevant threat on 6 alongside a solid 5 cost, but that also leaves a power deficit going into that turn. Ultimately, there is no if X then Y in games as complex as this, nor should there be. Card games are at their worst when one strategy can be wielded like a blunt object to hammer all nails. Recall pre-nerf Deathwave, Arrow Leader, Shuri Skull, or the Season of the Surfer, and while those metas can be fun, at least for a time, they ultimately limit player agency and Yomi to a very binary set of decks. Ones that win, and ones that beat the ones that win. And if you've watched me for a while, you know just how much I hate a binary. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you everyone who donated either time or money this month. There's still a week left. You could still do it and get your name up here. These are the people as follows who have done such a thing. The Tiny Ruby, A Frog in a Tent, Clips, Crayon Eater, Cole D, Polyhaze, Sartorius, Demisi, and KD. All of these people have donated to keep this channel running, to keep queer orgs running, or just gave some time. Just helped out the cause. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you have a great day. I hope you found this information elucidating, enlightening, or enriching. I'm bringing that back because I really feel that for this video. And I'll see you all tomorrow.